Hey guys and girls, Board now back with you. On this video I'm going to be talking about the new Hulu limited series. So this is episode 1 of Welcome to Chippendales. Full spoilers from the start of this review. So this very much feels like it's going to be in the mould of something like Pam and Tommy from last year, which was a very successful limited series for them. It has a similar sort of feel. It's a period piece. It's set in the 70s, I think, and it's the story of Shaman, or as he later becomes known, Steve, played by Imogen Najari. He is a very modest store manager at the start of the show, of the story. We see him being bullied and mocked by a couple of guys in his store. They're like basically robbing the place and show no respect for him when he tries to stop them. But we see that he's very popular with like the regional manager, or he's the regional manager. He's very popular with his boss, the general manager, and that the general manager says, "I'm going to reward you with a promotion." He's this sort of guy who is very hardworking and reliable, but at the same time he's very like business savvy. So he came up with a loyalty card scheme which has proved popular with the customers. So it's that combination which has the manager like interested in like keeping him on and promoting him. And it's just this thing where he says, "Yeah, sorry, I'm not interested," and we get quite a strong sense of his character in the opening moments of the episode, where he reveals that he lives a very lonely life. He doesn't have any family or responsibilities. He says he's like come to this country and has just saved. He's like spent very little on daily things, so he is like got up to like, I think he says $40,000, something like that at one point, and like his boss just, "Well, you've nearly got enough to own your own chain," and he says, "Yeah, I don't want that. I've got different ambitions." And then you get one of the great comedy beats where he reveals he actually wants to start like a backgammon like club, and that's slowly, when things don't quite work out with that, and there's surprisingly no takers, as you would think there maybe wouldn't be. He goes into partnership with this guy called Paul, who's played by Dan Stevens. Him and his girlfriend Dorothy is along, and they come across this idea when they're out at like a male strip club, or a male like club, a gay club at one point. And he stumbles upon this idea that Shaman / Steve to open up the first like male strip club in Los Angeles. He says it's selling the idea that women are into stripping as well. As Dorothy so eloquently puts it, yeah, that women are horny as well. Newsflash. So there's a market for this, and they start to explore that. So for the rest of the journey, it's like the ups and downs of them trying to get this off the ground. And at one point it seems to be taking off, but there's still something which is like just not quite right about it, not quite the finished article. And that's when they later on get this quite snobby like Hollywood producer who's won 2 Emmys, as he points out. One of the lines of the episode is like, Steve is like, "You won Emmy? You won an Emmy?" He's like, "No, I won 2 Emmys." So he comes on board and starts adding his own like more upmarket Broadway style to the production, and things go from there. And there's like tension between Paul and Dorothy. He's constantly jealous of her, and that's part of his whole thing. Then he's almost like bullshitting Steve at first, just to be like, just so that he'll give him a chance, and he admits that he's just paranoid about like all these hotshot producers or directors just taking Dorothy away from him if he doesn't have much going for him, seemingly. So that becomes a whole drama. And it's a good first episode. It's really solid. It's enjoyable to watch. There's some decent stuff set up with the characters. You've got a pretty good cast. I'll say about Dan Stevens actually, because he has developed into like this like nice little character actor where he's very good at playing quite slimy sort of characters, but also characters that are unpredictable, who could explode at like any moment. It's like unpredictable just the way some of his characters are gonna go, and you can tell he really enjoys playing against the sort of stereotypical Downton Abbey style character he was given, and he's very good in this. Now it's one of those things where until I got a good look at him, and later in the episode I actually didn't realise it was Dan Stevens. So once again, the hair and the makeup is like doing its job, obviously. But no, he is very good, and the episode does go in a darker direction towards the end with his paranoia and his rage bubbling over. But they get that about right, where it's always played on the cusp, where at times it comes off as quite funny, or at other times you're not quite sure. And it slowly builds to something more edgy, where it's like lurking under the surface, and you can just see that this guy isn't just blowing off steam, because at times he's like reasonably like likable, like he's a douche but in a quite an entertaining sort of way, and there seems to be quite a nice bond with him and Steve, so you don't always mind him, partly because you like Steve and you're there for the ride. But yeah, at times he comes off as a bit sexist. So there's like a thing with him and Dorothy where, probably in one of the weaker scenes, where Peter Bogdanovich shows up because they go for lunch. Because first of all, Paul gets like really jealous about Dorothy. Like, he can see she's really getting into like what Nick is doing with like his like routines with like the Chippendales. So he whisks her off to dinner because he's getting jealous, and then she bumps into Peter Bogdanovich, who offers her a role, and he goes to the natural place of, you know why he's asking you, he just wants to sleep with you, and it's that kind of thing. And she obviously rejects this, but the thing which makes him even more of an asshole is just the fact that he's trying to take away her power in the scene. He's almost sort of saying, you will sleep with him. You don't know it now, but you will do. And it's a very demeaning thing where, even though she's meant to be his girlfriend, he doesn't trust her, sort of thing, and is telling her this is the way it's going to be. And so the tone of it is very sort of nasty. And when he goes back to the club later and ends up getting fired by Nick, who Steve has given creative control to, that's when he completely just snaps. But I'll just say, good performances, Dan Stevens, also Nicole Pretz, who plays Dorothy. I think she's very good. Now, because of the way the episode ends, like it seems to be a one-shot deal, like for them in this episode. But I think they're very good. They're quite a nice couple. She's very sort of bubbly and charming, but she also has a little bit more to her, because one of the best scenes, as I said, is that scene outside the club when they first come up with the idea, because that scene's really effective in showing like Steve's his sort of character traits of, he's this guy from a foreign country, he hasn't really like established himself like in American culture, like he hasn't really got to grips with it and doesn't really understand it. So even though he's been living in California for a long time now. He still feels like a fish out of water. He still feels like he doesn't quite understand. He's not on the same page. And in some ways, he has just kept to himself in many ways and sort of done his own things. And so when they go to this gay club, he is very uncomfortable. Not because he's homophobic, I don't think that. Like, that's never implied. It's more just because, like, just how colourful and loud and in your face everything is, and just, yeah, the noise of it. He's just not comfortable. He's not a natural, like, party going guy. But it's when he starts seeing the reaction of the crowd and the whole performance of this thing in the club, where he has this idea for Chippendales. He has this idea for, as I said before, the first, like, strip club in California for female. And Paul is, like, being a bit of a dismissive asshole, and again he broadens on, like, sexism by once again assuming that women aren't like men. They're not into this sort of thing. And Dorothy once again steps in, and she's the one that actually convinces him that this is a good idea. Because once again, it's the comedy of backgammon. It isn't going to bring it in the crowds, but once again, that's fun character stuff with Sermon, because it's this idea of course he wouldn't think of anything too spectacular. He's just this modest guy who has this, like, entrepreneur type savvy about him, but he still doesn't really have a clue about what's gonna attract big crowds, what's gonna bring people into, like, a club in America. So he just naturally goes to backgammon first of all, until he has this epiphany. And there's actually some good stuff on gender in the episode, because there's also a scene where Nick, when he's talking to the performers, he tells them about how women are different than men in the way they view things, about how they prefer to have a story. It's not just about razzmatazz, that they like to follow a plot, which there's something to that. It's not, like, obviously strictly true, and that's a bit of a stereotype as well, but there is something to that which has been sort of proven. But that's what he's going for, and there's certain things about gender in this and about old-fashioned sort of ideals. But the reason the whole thing works is because of the characters, because of Najami, who's just this excellent actor, who's he's very likeable and charismatic, but also very understated, where he's very good at playing this. He's not necessarily that nervous, but just this guarded, reserved sort of guy. And I think that's why you go with the character in this first episode. And it's almost why he's so good at what he does in many cases, although he's a bit naive to the wider picture and what works in this sort of business, in this sort of setup. And yeah, there's certain things about his fish out of water stuff which is really funny and entertaining. So he doesn't know who Peter Bogdanovich is, for example, when Paul tells him. So that's kind of funny, and it just makes him this sort of outsider, and that's really fun to watch and play with. But you just see, like, when he's, like, promoting the club and getting people in and handing out flyers, how, like, even if you sort of thought he was a bit of a bullshit artist, a bit of a sort of, like, jokey con man, you would still be seduced probably, just because he comes across as an everyday guy, and that is part of his appeal. Now, what'll be interesting is, as things go on, if they start, like, going to darker places, which they do later on in the episode, and at the end, and you sort of feel they're gonna, like, get more into, like, the cutthroat nature of Hollywood, and because as things go on, he starts to want to, like attract sort of mainstream people to the club, to make it a bit more than just like, yeah, just for like your everyday sort of Joe in a way. But he sees the potential in that, how, you know, it can bring the club more attention. So, and I'm sure Najani can play that stuff as well. So the first episode is just enjoyable character drama, some good comedy in it. It's well done, again, like a lot of these Hulu's like limited series, because it's got that 70s sort of sheen about it. Everything looks pretty authentic. One thing it may struggle with is it could just come off as feeling like another typical Hulu type miniseries, but so far, because of Najani, and it's got a little bit of a niche because this particular area hasn't really been covered before, not in this way. This is, you know, a bit different to like the Full Monty. I think this is going to have more of that satirical sort of edge about it, I feel. So, pardon. So far, I'm into it. I can see this being like, you know, this year's Pam and Tommy. Maybe it has that sort of potential, and we have the really dark ending. Obviously, we sort of see when Paul and Dorothy, they're both dead in their hotel room, and I'm not sure. Maybe they're saying that he got in a rage and shot her and then shot himself. It's possibly, like, we don't know that for sure. We just see that they're both dead at the end because Steve calls him, and we see like Steve maybe starting to act a bit shallow, because after the whole thing, like, he didn't really ever bust up with Paul, but Paul stormed off when he was like sacked by Nick. And yeah, that's one thing where maybe Nick was a bit harshly done by, because he had been doing the MCing, and then suddenly Nick's got creative control, so he's like, hey, you know, I don't like your negative vibe, so you're not going to be MCing anymore. And yeah, like, I think Steve could have stepped in there, and maybe, obviously he was being very aggressive and yeah, negative vibes, but he had been like with him all the way, so he definitely could have, you know, stepped in there maybe. But we see what it leads to at the end, and intriguing stuff in episode 1. So that's welcome to Chippendales. And yeah, I'm gonna cover episode 2 for sure, but let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you've seen this one, like and subscribe, share me out on social media. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.